The eviction notice was zip-tied to my apartment door, snapping against the metal frame every time the wind came off Lake Ontario, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small could feel so heavy. 12 days. That's what the letter gave me. 12 days to come up with $11,000 I didn't have, or pack up the only home I'd had since I was 26, and figure out where a 31-year-old man with no savings and no plan was supposed to go. My name is Cole Bramwell, and 4 months before that letter showed up, I was running the warehouse floor at a logistics company out in Mississauga. Decent job. Not the kind you brag about at a dinner party, but the kind that let me make rent, buy groceries without doing math in my head at the checkout, and once in a while take myself out for wings and a pint without feeling guilty about it. Then the company lost its biggest contract, the one that basically paid for half the building, and within 6 weeks they'd cut almost the entire shift I worked. No warning, really. Just a meeting on a Tuesday morning and a severance check that lasted about as long as my optimism did. I want to be honest about something, because I think people skip over this part when they tell stories like mine. I wasn't lazy. I applied for over 90 jobs in those 4 months. I tracked them in a spreadsheet because at some point watching the rejection emails pile up felt less awful if I could turn it into data instead of into another little wound. Warehouses, call centers, a stint trying to get hired at a hardware store, even a few logistics postings 2 hours outside the city that I was willing to commute to. Nothing stuck. A couple of interviews went fine and then just went quiet, the way things do now, where companies don't even bother telling you no anymore. The shame crept in slow the way it does. It wasn't dramatic. It was small things. Not wanting to run into my upstairs neighbor because she'd ask how the job hunt was going and I'd have to perform optimism I didn't have. Skipping the corner store I used to go to because the guy who worked there always asked about my hockey pool picks, and I didn't have the energy to be a person who still cared about hockey pools. Eating cheaper and cheaper without telling anyone why. Like if nobody noticed, it wasn't really happening. By day 8 of the 12, I'd started boxing things up. Not because I'd given up exactly, but because some practical part of my brain had taken over from the hopeful part, and that part of me knew that even if a miracle happened, I'd still need to be ready to move fast. I was wrapping my grandfather's old radio in a towel, the only thing of real value I owned, when there was a knock at the door. Soft, almost apologetic, like whoever it was already knew they were interrupting something. I opened it, expecting the building super, maybe with another notice, another deadline. Instead, it was Margaret Halloway. Margaret owned the building. I'd met her maybe 4 or 5 times in the 3 years I'd lived there. Always brief, always polite. She was somewhere in her early 60s, silver gray hair cut short and practical. The kind of woman who wore a wool coat even in early fall because she ran cold. And she had this way of looking at you that didn't feel like judgment, just attention. Like she was actually listening instead of waiting for her turn to talk. I felt my whole chest tighten. I figured she was there about the notice. Maybe to make sure I understood the timeline. Maybe just to confirm I was actually leaving. I stepped back to let her in mostly out of instinct, and she walked past me slowly, her eyes moving over the half-packed boxes, the bare bookshelf, the dent in the carpet where my armchair used to sit before I sold it on Facebook Marketplace for $60 2 days earlier. She didn't say anything right away. She just stood there for a second, taking it in, and then she sat down on the edge of my couch like she'd been invited, which she hadn't. But it didn't feel rude somehow. It felt like she needed a second, too. I got back from my sister's place in Halifax this morning, she said. Went through the building paperwork before I'd even unpacked my suitcase. Saw your file. She paused. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Tell me what happened, she said. Not unkindly. Not like an accusation. Just a question sitting there in the room, waiting. I want to tell you I held it together and gave her some calm, composed explanations. I didn't. It came out messy. The warehouse closing. The spreadsheet of rejections. The way I'd started avoiding people in the building because I couldn't stand the look of pity. The fact that I hadn't told my mom back in Sudbury because I didn't want her worrying from 4 hours away with nothing she could actually do about it. Margaret just listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice. Didn't do that thing people do where they jump in with their own story to make you feel better. She let me finish. When I was done, the apartment went quiet again. Just the radiator ticking and the sound of traffic down on the street. She nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting most of what I'd said. I'm going to tell you something about myself, she said, and then I'm going to make you an offer. And I need you to actually think about it before you answer, because it's not what you're expecting. Before she'd bought this building, back in the early 90s, Margaret had run a small non-profit out of a rented space in Parkdale, helping people coming off hard stretches get back on their feet. Not handouts, she was careful to say. Direction. Resume help, interview practice, connections to local employers willing to take a chance on someone with a gap in their work history. She'd shut it down almost 20 years ago when the funding dried up, and she got tired of fighting for scraps every year, and she'd gone into real estate instead, bought this building, then 2 more. I've been thinking about starting something like that again, she said. Different name, different setup, but the same idea. There's a vacant storefront I own 2 blocks from here. Used to be a dry cleaner. I keep meaning to do something with it and keep not doing it. She looked at me directly. I'm not going to evict you, Cole. I'm canceling the notice, and I want you to stay here rent-free for the next 4 months. In exchange, I want your help getting this thing off the ground. Painting, fixing it up, figuring out the programs, talking to people who walk in scared the way you probably are right now. I actually laughed, which in hindsight was a strange reaction, but it came out before I could stop it. I can't even get myself a job, I said. What good am I going to be helping other people get one? She smiled in that calm, unhurried way she had. Sometimes the people who are best at helping someone through something are the ones who've actually been through it, not the ones who read about it in a textbook. I took 2 days to actually agree, mostly because I kept waiting for the catch, some fine print that would turn this into something else. There wasn't one. She had her lawyer draw up something simple, 4 months rent-free, in writing, no strings beyond what she'd already told me. I signed it at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me, still half convinced I was missing something. The weeks after that felt like somebody had reached into my life and turned the lights back on. I started waking up around the same time I used to for the warehouse shift, except now there was somewhere to go that wasn't a job application portal. Margaret and I gutted that old dry cleaner together. We pulled up cracked linoleum, found someone's family donating folding tables from a church basement renovation, painted the walls a soft gray, because Margaret said white felt too clinical, and she wanted it to feel like somewhere you'd actually want to sit. We called local businesses, some who said no, plenty who said yes once they understood it wasn't charity. Charity's sake, it was practical. Resumes, mock interviews, connections to trades programs through the community college. People started showing up before we'd even finished painting the sign. A woman named Priya who'd been out of the workforce for 6 years raising her kids and had no idea how to explain the gap to an employer. A guy in his 50s named Doug who'd worked the same factory floor for 22 years until it closed and didn't know how to write a resume because he'd never needed one. A 19-year-old kid, quiet, didn't say much, who just wanted to know if trade school was actually worth the debt. Every single one of them reminded me of myself 3 weeks earlier, and every time one of them left with something, an interview booked, a contact made, even just a plan that didn't feel hopeless, something in my own chest loosened a little more. About 7 weeks into all this, a man named Ronald Vance came by. He ran a mid-sized logistics and supply company out near the airport, and he'd heard about the center through a Chamber of Commerce contact and wanted to drop off some old office furniture they were replacing. We got to talking while we unloaded chairs from his truck, and I mentioned the warehouse job, the closure, the 4 months of nothing. His eyebrows went up. We're actually expanding our distribution side, he said, looking for someone who knows floor operations, not just someone who can talk about it in an interview. 2 days later, I was sitting across from him in an actual office, not a Zoom call, an actual room with windows, and for the first time in 5 months, I walked out having said yes to something instead of waiting to hear it. I kept volunteering at the center on weekends, even after I started full-time. It had stopped being a project somewhere along the way and turned into something closer to mine, the way a thing becomes yours, not because you own it but because you bled into it a little. It's been a little over 2 years now. The center, Margaret ended up naming it after her late husband, has helped more than 600 people in this neighborhood find work, housing referrals, or just somewhere to sit and feel like someone was actually listening to them for an hour. I still think about that night on my couch sometimes, half-packed boxes everywhere, certain my life was about to get smaller, when really it was about to get bigger than I ever expected. Margaret didn't see a guy who couldn't pay his rent. She saw someone worth betting on before he was ready to bet on himself. And I think that's the part that stays with me most, that sometimes the worst week of your life is just the quiet beginning of something you couldn't have written yourself.